Welcome in everyone to Flyover Footy, breaking news edition, emergency pod, whatever you want to call it. Thank you for joining us as you're watching this live on a Monday for lunch, as you're looking at this later on to just see what the news is and how everybody's breaking it down. I appreciate you joining us on Flyover Footy, where it's just me today, bringing you the info. Obviously, everybody's busy during lunch. Lots going on today in the world of St. Louis City. So waiting for kind of the chat to fill, waiting for everybody to join us, and then we'll get going with the pod recording itself in just a moment. So bring any questions you have, drop them in the chat, and we'll get through this because there is a lot to digest about the firing of Lutz Pfannenstiel, a day that I don't think a lot of people, no, I don't think anybody legitimately saw this coming today. But yeah, it's not just groundbreaking news. First sporting director in the history of St. Louis City to be, first sporting director in the history of St. Louis City, now dismissed. So we're going to dive into it all. The press release, we've got multiple media articles that have already been posted about this. So it is very clear that Diego did the rounds a little bit ahead of this news to get out in front with some quotes. And there's a lot to take away in some of these quotes. I'll say that there's some real depth to what we can read into what just happened, but also where St. Louis City goes forward here in the next few months up to a year. Yeah, Flyover Daily. I can't commit to daily podcasts as much as we're kind of treading that water at this point. I do appreciate the club, I guess, at the very, being comical about this for doing this during the day as opposed to at night. The firing of Olaf Melberg happened at like 6 or 7 o'clock at night. So that was a joy to be able to say, hey, fam, you got to break away for a little bit because what else can you do? So thank you all for joining us to this craziness, as Josh Zeller says, over lunchtime. I'm going to start the pod recording in just a moment, so nobody's missed anything. And this is going to be one of those that if you've got a question, drop it in because I'm going to get to it, and we're going to answer these things. We're going to figure it out. We're going to see what's on the minds of everybody, and we're going to wrap our heads around every aspect of this that we can. So let's get going. Welcome everyone to Flyover Footy. My name is Matt Baker. Thank you so much for joining us on this breaking news edition of Flyover Footy to discuss the dismissal, the firing, the parting of ways between St. Louis City SC and their first ever sporting director, Lutz Pfannenstiel. It was announced by the club on Monday morning that Lutz Pfannenstiel, the first ever sporting director of St. Louis City, has been dismissed of his duties and will be moving on. St. Louis City has a lot going on this season. They obviously have been underperforming for months, years, borderline, and this is the latest casualty, the dismissal of Lutz Pfannenstiel. So let's get right to it. We're looking at what the announcement by the club is to set the stage for this entire conversation. St. Louis City SC today announced the departure of the club's sporting director, Lutz Pfannenstiel. With the MLS summer transfer window closing last week, President and GM Diego Gigliani and club technical director John Hackworth will work with the team's current sporting staff on ongoing roster management and construction, including player contract negotiations, while the team searches for a permanent replacement. The article goes into detail Lutz's resume, his pedigree, one of the first players, if not the first player to play in all 6 continents. The press release rather goes on to say, but as City SC enters its next phase and looks to evaluate its performance after 2 back-to-back years of inconsistent play and on-field challenges, the plan is to move in another direction while building on the foundation Pfannenstiel established. Quotes from Diego Gigliani on here are, "These decisions are never easy, and with the legacy Lutz built during his time here, he will always be part of the extended City family. From the very beginning, Lutz has shown real passion and commitment to this project, and the foundation he established was integral to the club's historic first season. As we enter the next phase of the club's long-term plan to lift up the region and help both the team and St. Louis achieve its potential, the next 5 years will be extremely important and believe a change in sporting leadership will help in the club's pursuit of its goals. Diego goes on to say, unfortunately, we've struggled to create sporting stability and haven't been able to meet the expectations of our owners or our fans, despite increasing the investment in the squad consistently. Carolyn Kindle, CEO and member of St. Louis City's ownership group, says, Lutz was one of our most important hires in the early days of the club and deserves so much of the credit for our early success. But more than that, he believed in the ownership group's vision of being about more than just soccer and embrace the St. Louis community. This club and the city can't thank Lutz and Amalia enough for all they have done for City SC. And the press release closes by saying that Diego and John Hackworth will assume Pfannenstiel's responsibilities as the team finishes out the 2025 season and looks to address the steps the team needs to take to ensure future sporting success. A lot to unpack here, and let's start from the very beginning about Lutz's history with the club. Let's set the stage for not just this. This is not just the dismissal of a sporting director, but it's the dismissal of a cornerstone piece of everything that St. Louis City has been built upon thus far. I'm not just talking the rosters. I'm not just talking the first team. I'm talking about this entire organization has had Lutz Pfannenstiel's fingerprints on it. The one I received comments earlier this year talking about juxtaposing the success of City 2 versus the failures or the underachievings of City. But let's be clear, every single piece of this organization from top to bottom, and let's go from bottom to the top in how it was built, was done by Lutz. The stadium, the training grounds, partially designed by input from Lutz. On what he wanted to see and how the locker room was set up, what his experiences were, having toured, given that history that he has. But we're talking about the academy. We're talking about City 2. We're talking about City, obviously. But from 2020 up until now, every single thing that's been created, the personnel hired, the players recruited, it's all been under Lutz. The styles of play that we've had from the first team on has been pretty obviously driven by Lutz, the gegenpressing style, the idea that the sporting director and the leadership in the front office dictate the style and the organizational philosophy, with Hackworth's original title being the director of coaching. And the coach comes in and implements and gets the most out of the players. That's been the style so far, very German style. And so the dismissal of Lutz isn't just the latest stone to fall in an underperforming team. The dismissal of Lutz will send shockwaves through the St. Louis City organization, and it could very well send shockwaves to the identity of St. Louis City. Diego has a lot of quotes that are making the rounds, not just in this press release, but in articles in The Athletic and in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. We're going to get to them all in just a couple of minutes, but the biggest thing here is that we're not just at a turning point in the ability to sign players, which is the first thing you think of when you think of a sporting director. We are at an inflection point for the organization as a whole. This move and what will happen subsequent to it, the hiring of the new sporting director, the hiring of the next coach, this will make or break Diego Gigliani as that next leader up. It's not hard to follow the breadcrumbs in. One of the questions I had on social media was, why not Diego? Why was Diego not dismissed? Why was it Lutz left holding the bill? And the answer is pretty clear on that. The way this works in general, when you have underperforming teams, is that accountability starts at the bottom and it works its way up. Yes, I know the sporting director, the ownership, the president, GM, all three, Carolyn Kindle, Diego, and Lutz, they've all accepted responsibility for how things have gone. The head coach accepts responsibility for how things go. But what I mean to say is that when things underperform, it starts with the players. It starts with turning over the roster. If you have an underperforming team, which St. Louis did arguably at the end of 2023, but definitely the beginning of 2024, you turn over players. You send some underperformers out, you bring some better players in, hopefully better players. And if that doesn't work, if that doesn't fix things, the coach is the next to fall. And it did with Bradley Carnell. That continued to where the next coach fell under Olaf Melberg. And so you're continuing with the player turnover, you're continuing with coaching turnover. And at this point, after the transfer window closed, the next domino falls with Lutz. He's the next man up, that next highest person. On top of Lutz now in the hierarchy is Diego Gigliani. the president and GM, who was hired in April of 2023, which is very noteworthy, and a lot of crosshairs, my own as a part of that, started to form at the beginning of this season when Olaf Melberg started to fail as St. Louis City head coach. And you go back in history and you say, when did this start to fall apart? When did the wheels start to come off of this ship? And it was in a lot of ways before the end of 2023. So there is a level of justification when folks question Diego, because our success leading into the summer transfer window where Diego actually took his position in 2023, we had a modicum of success. Now, I think it's a correlation without causation necessarily, because I don't correlate the downfall of our 2023 season at the very end, where we did have a dip at the end. I don't correlate that to Diego. I don't necessarily correlate every single move made under Diego's leadership to a failure of sorts. And Lutz does accept a bulk of the responsibility, both in the hiring of Olaf Melberg, but also the player movements themselves. As the sporting director, that's his scope of responsibility. Diego works with him in a similar, not the same, but similar way to John Hackworth as technical director, works with him in a different capacity, but it's Lutz at the helm. And so for this to happen at the end of the summer transfer window is noteworthy in a few different ways. And I've said it on social media that my opinion of why it happened at the end of the transfer window as opposed to earlier on or before the transfer window or during the transfer window, more so has to do with the quote in the press release that Diego said about, unfortunately, we've struggled to create sporting stability and haven't been able to meet the expectations of our owners or fans despite increasing our investment in the squad consistently. This reads to me more like a last straw of sorts. When the transfer window came and went and the team wasn't improved to the level that I would say Diego probably wanted it to be improved. We brought in Song Bin, and I'll even list out really quick just so you have that fresh in your mind of all the players that we sent out and brought in, because we talked about it on Flyover Footy in the past couple of weeks. We essentially sent out Rasmus Alm via season-ending injury. Joachim Nilsson, we bought him out. Giannis Horn, we declined the option to purchase. Sent out Jabulu Blom, Selmer Pedro, Nuki Thorson. Sent out John De Silva. We had a lot of cleanup, and we only brought in, I say only, think of these names, think of the value of these players. We brought in Falou Fall, Songbin Jong, Haziel Orozco, Devin Padelford, and we signed Makai Joyner on to the supplemental roster from his off-roster homegrown. So that's 4 players brought into St. Louis, and then adding Makai Joyner to the supplemental. And of those 4 players, you have Falou Fall, who's the long-term vision, and then you have 2 more or less second-team call-ups in Haziel Orozco and Devin Padelford, Songbin Jong. So significant investment, I think, is being made. And whether or not it is quick to the trigger right after the transfer window and saying he did all he could and we aren't happy with what it was, or if they knew ahead of time that if Lutz didn't make a splash, we were going to make this move. I think this reminds me of the Bradley Carnell dismissal in the sense that when it happened last season, and by the way, what is up with Vancouver? This is the second time that we've played Vancouver, and then immediately after a loss, somebody's lost their job. So as much as we like to say we play San Jose, and that has a special place in our heart for the next man up or the interim coach or the bounce back game, we got to watch out for Vancouver going forward, because if we lose to Vancouver in Vancouver, it seems like somebody's going to lose their job. So that's just, it has to be said, because it's the craziest of coincidences. But going back to when Bradley Carnell was dismissed, it was said by Lutz that if he had won against Vancouver, he would have kept his job. So in that sense, it was, yes, we were planning for it, but one last chance kind of a thing. And this reads to me somewhat similar. And I might be reading between the lines too much or reading too much into it, but right after the transfer window closes, just a few days, 4 days after the transfer window closes, you get this move where he didn't make the investment. He didn't land the signings with supposedly the investment that we were making continuously. And so because of that, swing and a miss on this one, it was too many swings and misses of sorts. There are plenty of other aspects to this. And so I'm going to go to the chat really quick and bring up the point that it's something to do's making, where over on Blue Sky, Manuel Veth is reporting that Lutz had, quote, a big falling out with ownership and that Vancouver was the last straw. So this is to my point of Vancouver being the last straw of sorts. The falling out with ownership could read a lot of different ways. Some of the ways I absolutely do not want to get into, because falling out with ownership doesn't read to me like you saw differently as far as bringing in a player versus not. That to me has potential off-field implications, interpersonal type dynamics that are ongoing that I just do not want to wade into. But that has a lot behind it, that phrase of a falling out with ownership. It's a lot easier if we just stick to on-field performances and roster maneuvering, bringing in players, all that stuff. It's a lot easier to draw a straight line of why this happened. But the other aspects that Diego really is going into here on some of these quotes, especially in the Post-Dispatch and in the Athletic, deal with the natural end of a 5-year cycle. He tells the Post-Dispatch and he tells the Athletic, a 5-year cycle is a very reasonable, this is Diego Gigliani talking, a 5-year cycle is a very reasonable amount of time to give a sporting director to come in, set a strategy, and execute towards that strategy to be able to assess results. And then when we do look at results over the last 3 seasons, we of course had an incredible fairy tale start to year 1, but years 2 and 3 have been really difficult, both in terms of results and also in terms of instability. He goes on to say, I think as we look around and set our sights on the next 5-year cycle for this club, we need to think about, do we have the right people in the right roles to be able to get us there? We felt this was the right moment to close the chapter on Lutz's time and start a chapter with a new sporting director for the next 5-year period. The instability aspect of this, I think, is the breadcrumbs were there. The instability to me is not just in player turnover, like Tim Parker being turned over just a year and a half after helping this team get off to the start they did. That's not that sense. It's really the head coach, quick to pull the trigger on Bradley Carnell. For better or for worse, no matter what our performance was at that time, Bradley Carnell never got the opportunity to see the players that Lutz was bringing in. Lutz gave him a roster. That roster was hurt. He had to sign City 2 players. He told us himself back in June of 2024, get my years mixed up here, that he was just bridging the gap until these players could arrive. He was on life support. He was admitting it, and he never got that opportunity. So introducing that instability in coaching seems like what Diego could be getting at right here. The other aspect to this being the 5-year cycle, where Diego may be putting himself under a little bit of a time crunch here. And I've got a lot to say about, and we can talk about Diego a little bit here, but there's a couple other points that are in this Post-Dispatch article that are very, very important to make note of. And that really is the timeline of what's about to happen. With the dismissal of Lutz now, we have no head coach and we have no sporting director. We have David Critchley serving as interim coach of City. We have John Hackworth, who is now serving as interim head coach of City 2, the club's technical director, and every single responsibility that I mentioned earlier as far as the roster, player contract negotiations with Diego, all of that. It's working with the sporting staff, roster management, contract negotiations, and the team's search for a permanent replacement to the sporting director. So 2 other things here really quick is the timeline. The timeline that Diego spells out for the Post-Dispatch is that they look to have the sporting director hired first. That's the big thing. So the head coaching search, I'm not saying it's on pause, but it is not being prioritized right now. It is not the first thing that they're going to make happen. The first thing is going to be the sporting director. And then Diego goes on in this Post-Dispatch article to say that the sporting director that they hire will have a say in the coaching search. So think about that. Think about the timeline in which we're operating under, where it's August 25th. And keep in mind that training camp for the 2026 season starts in early to mid-January. Okay, we're talking September, October, November, December, January. That's 5 months. So 5 months. And if that number gives you PTSD, it's because there was a 5-month timeline in the hiring of Olaf Melberg. I don't want to harp on that, but I can't help but draw the comparison to the timeline that we took to hire Olaf Melberg being 5 months, and this 5 months to the start of 2026. And why that's important is because in the Athletic, in addition to the Post-Dispatch, Diego also says and provides a quote that they hope to have both the sporting director and the head coach in place to start camp in 2026. So the timelines here are condensed. And if Diego's talking to multiple areas in the press release, in the Post Dispatch, in the Athletic, and elsewhere, who he's talked to, talking about a 5-year plan, and this move to remove Lutz comes 5 years and 8 days after his initial hiring. So we're right at 5 years of Lutz Pfannenstiel. If this move is designed to pivot into the next 5 years of the club, even if it's another 5-year cycle that you're looking to be towards, you're putting yourself on the clock. And I just wonder how smart of an idea that is to set these expectations, especially coming after the Olaf Melberg hiring and firing that happened with a 5-month search and 15 games. You don't have a good track record. Diego Gigliani does not have a great track record of this, just like Lutz didn't, because both of those moves, Bradley Carnell and the hiring of Olaf Melberg, happened under Diego's watch as well. Lutz might have been running point on that, but it also happened under Diego. And that's why earlier I said the accountability starts at the bottom in this scenario. And so, yeah, the next accountable person to this, unless you're going to toss John Hackworth into it as technical director, is Diego Gigliani. So the spotlight, I'm not saying the heat is on his seat. The spotlight becomes more fully focused on Diego at this point. Having taken the job, announced in April of 2023, taken it in the summer of 2023, the track record on the field, the track record in the continuity of coaches, there's a lot of really unfortunate, really bad things on the track record of Diego right alongside Lutz. And he's worked right alongside Lutz this entire time. So this is the opportunity that Diego has to instill what he wants to do in this organization. And he has John Hackworth right alongside of him. In this search, the other maybe final really noteworthy point to make in this search is in the Athletic article, Diego Gigliani said that John Hackworth, if interested, will be considered for the full-time sporting director position along with other candidates. So while we know Hackworth was a candidate last year for the head coaching job, and this year Lutz said Hackworth's position was more valuable as technical director, and so he wasn't being considered for the head coach. Now we have Diego Gigliani saying not only is he a valuable front office person to help him run point on sporting director duties, he's in contention for the sporting director job of all things. If John Hackworth isn't the MVP of this organization at this point in time, I don't know who is. Between director of coaching to technical director, city 2 to interim city 2, this man does it all. And I don't, aside from his run club, I have no idea when this man sleeps, because the work he's doing does come with a pretty good track record of success. We don't know the exact things that he's had his fingerprints on as far as technical director goes, director of coaching. We do know there's been pretty good alignment in coaching from the academy up to City 2 as far as the styles of play go from that level. But the performances of Hackworth on the sidelines, that's pretty good. And so I'm interested to see what more we hear from Diego and John Hackworth, maybe specifics on their responsibilities, specifics about, how this process is unfolding, so on and so forth. Looking into some questions, I would say in the chat, let's go to this one. Gary Hibbets, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but is this to distract us from, quote, that call? No, we're still all upset about that call. Just an unfortunate coincidence that call happens in a game against Vancouver where, it leads to this. I think the two are mutually exclusive. Not ready to go into that full tinfoil hat mode, like Chris Gebhardt said. I do think, like Armin III says, that this window was the nail in the coffin. I absolutely agree with that. Said it a little bit ago that this move coming after the transfer window is very intentional to me. It's not that you wanted to remove Lutz ahead of the window, and then, because let's war games this out. What happens if you remove Lutz at the beginning of this transfer window? You're asking Diego and John Hackworth to step in and make all the moves, and they weren't prepared to be making those decisions at that level. Of course, they were informed. Of course, they're part of the decision making, but we're talking boots on the ground, plugged into the scouts, plugged into every single thing, and being responsible for the decision. And you're wondering why Lutz wasn't removed so that they can immediately take that on and make something better happen in this transfer window. That to me makes a little bit less sense than this was the last straw. This was ownership saying, we are willing to invest, especially if you read into what Diego's comments were in the press release. The investment is increasing year over year, and it has been. Last year, we were excited about Marcel Hartl as the most expensive signing on a free transfer when he's making $2 million a year. This year, at least, we get Song Bin and we get Falou Fall, who, just quick math, if you combine them, is at or around the $5 million range of investment, 5+ if you get into incentives. That's a pretty good jump. Now, it's not setting the world on fire. It's not making splashes in headlines of the biggest spending MLS teams, but it is a bigger investment. And so that is demonstrably true, that the ownership is investing more year over year. It's the results of who Lutz is bringing in and able to bring in, I think, from that may be speaking to this, and maybe why this happens after this transfer window. And I've said it before. I go back to the previous transfer window, the winter one, with the signing of Jean da Silva. To me, the signing of Jean da Silva is an abject failure in every single possible way. It was I said it last week that it was a low risk flyer, but when I say it's an abject failure, I think of when it happened in the transfer window and what we got out of it. Yeah, it was a flyer at the end of the window. So if you just look at it from that lens, no harm, no foul, essentially, because you brought him in. He had promised previously. Atlanta was eating his money. It was a good deal. But at the same time, he clearly wasn't the target for that transfer window. And so you missed. And now you're looking at this transfer window, and you leave one senior roster slot open at the end of this window, knowing that you have a lot of contracts that are going to be expiring. I don't know if Lutz was told, don't fill this last roster slot because, we haven't been happy with what you've done so far. We believe we're going to make this move, thinking this, obviously not telling him this. We're going to make this move, and so we want you to leave this open. I don't know if he received direction for that. It's possible. It's believable. But the track record, I think, of what we know, especially with Jean da Silva and when that deal occurred, that's a little bit damning to me. And it's a little bit more obvious that he couldn't have been in any decently sized thought process. He couldn't have been the primary target. Maybe the secondary, maybe the tertiary, but and I'm sorry, Drew. I'm really sorry to harp on Jean da Silva again, but I just think that's reflective of this failure. I do think also, Matthew Melly, could it be due to the lack of bringing in a bigger name person? That's kind of what I mean about this, is the swings and the misses. It's not that there was a lack of trying to bring in certain players. There may have been a lack of ability to invest in the level that it would have taken to bring in some of those players. Like we heard Josh Sargent was in the market for like a $20 million transfer fee. That was rumored. FC Cincinnati made a bid on him. I think that level of investment, I don't think St. Louis is going to jump from 2 to 5 to 20 in the same window. But I think there's a happy medium here where St. Louis was willing to invest and Lutz couldn't land maybe some of the targets, whether they were his targets or maybe Diego's targets. I don't know. But I think there was, whether it was a big name like Firmino or somebody else that we didn't know, because we definitely don't know about all these moves that are being made. I think there are reasons to believe that Lutz couldn't get certain moves done, certain players brought in, and Diego was seeing this and felt it time to pull the trigger at this point when it happened again, as coinciding with that 5-year cycle. That was kind of, it does make for a good break, all things considered. It makes for a good story. It makes for a good, this makes sense. Safe says City doesn't spend money for transfer fees. That's a big issue. Everyone else is spending large amounts. That is a big issue. We did see the beginnings, I would say, and it's tough in year 3 to really talk about the beginnings, but the beginnings of being willing to spend transfer fees. Last season, we did pay a transfer fee to get Jake Girdwood Reich, about $800,000 in a transfer fee to Sydney. This season, we paid a transfer fee for a Falou Fall. We paid a transfer fee for Song Bin, and they were, I think this could have been the beginnings. Maybe it is the beginnings, and the next sporting director is going to be the beneficiary of a club now able and willing to spend on transfer fees, because it did become noteworthy during the tenure of Lutz as the club was beginning and in the first couple of years that he was targeting free transfers. That's one of the reasons why Cedric Teuchert didn't arrive when he did, because we were negotiating over a transfer fee in the winter and spring of 2024. as opposed to ending up getting him on a free that summer. That's a good example, and something I think we might see the next sporting director just have more fortuitous ability with. The 3 years of Lutz in general, we saw the downward trend of 56 points, 37 points, 21 points so far. So that definitely plays into it, the underperforming of the players that he has brought in. So this isn't just a story of failing to bring in players in general, because he succeeded in a lot of ways. Lutz did in the summer of 2024, bringing in a lot of those players. Marcel Hartl, Cedric Teuchert, Jonas Horn, Simon Becher, all those players were brought in, and they saw a modicum of success at the end of last season under Hackworth, but it was unable to be replicated by and large. I think minus Marcel Hartl and maybe Jonas Horn, depending on how you were looking at it when he wasn't hurt, you'd have a hard time saying that any single one of those signings besides Jonas Horn or besides Marcel Hartl was a true success that was replicated year over year. And maybe that plays into the instability that Diego referenced in some of his comments. I think that plays into it just as much as anything. This also, for just awareness, City is now City now makes 4 of the last 6 expansion clubs. I saw this on social media, and it is correct that, not including San Diego, to fire their sporting director within the club's first 3 years. Notably, FC Cincinnati, I think Austin did it. Looking at Charlotte, so you've got City now falling into that latest bucket of expansion teams that have at various times underperformed so heavily in the first 3 years that they fired their sporting director. So that's something I think noteworthy in the context of Major League Soccer, and was discussed pretty heavily in the shiftings of Major League Soccer, the dynamics, what the sporting director looks for, and what a good sporting director has on their resume. That's in the Athletic article that I think is a really interesting one, talking about the inevitability of change in MLS. Current league setup puts a huge premium on understanding complex roster rules, where it seems to be going more towards like the global landscape. And Diego does comment on that correlations between spend and performance, as they exist anywhere else in the world, starting to look a lot more like South American and European leagues. Your ability to think long-term and make the right decisions, find the right talent, create the right organization, not just this year-to-year building like MLS does with the roster rules, but these long-term visions where you're maybe paying bigger transfer fees, you're locking in players for longer contracts, and you're thinking more holistically about how can I keep these players for multiple years. That seems to be something that they're kind of shifting towards as well. But again, the onus is very much more on Diego Gigliani at this point about the responsibilities he has and is taking on. Like I said, the spotlight's going to be shining a lot more heavily on Diego throughout this entire thing. Talked about the timeline of the hire, talked about the timeline of the coaching hire, how that's going to play into it. John Hackworth, I think, takes another starring role, like I said, in not just his responsibilities with Diego, but as a candidate for the sporting director job. That's going to be a storyline to follow in all of this. The experience that they look for in the sporting director, whether it's MLS, I've seen fans toss out names like Peter Vermees for a dual role, Jim Curtin for a coaching role, and I think that will, while they may be considered, Peter Vermees had a pretty horrendous track record the past few years, at least in Kansas City. He the fans turned on him for years. He overstayed his welcome. Having one person in that dual role is a massive risk. And if there's one thing that I think we don't want St. Louis to do, it's take risks at this point. The hiring for MLS experience in this role, it just doesn't read like that's Diego's priority in some of these comments. So I think this is going to be something we watch in the global landscape, whether it's South America, whether it's Europe, and we see who might be available with experience that we might want. Because like I said, this is also an opportunity that we could see the biggest turnover, even possibly a change in the organizational philosophy. We could see, because it started with Lutz, right? This is Lutz's blueprint, Lutz's fingerprints on everything. We could see a change in organizational philosophy as a result of this. If Diego's talking about the next 5-year cycle, you're talking about the identity of St. Louis City for the next 5 years or so. You're talking about Diego putting his fingerprints on this organization much more directly, and that could impact a lot of stuff. Conceptually, it just could mean he wants to see something different, and so he's willing to entertain an organizational shift to something else. And bringing in a sporting director who sees that vision, wants to put together a club, wants to put together an entire organization, that is built around a different philosophy. Maybe it's more possession based. Maybe it's more tiki-taka. Maybe it's less overall pressing, more low block, more counterattacking from a low block. I don't know. It could also be consistent. There's so much unknown at this point in time, just a couple hours after this news happens, that I think we will have to wait and see more about what Diego says. Some of the comments will be interesting on what he expects, what he's looking for, some of the qualities, and some of the qualities he's not looking for. Does he want to kind of blow up the organizational philosophy, for lack of a better term, or will he keep it consistent? Is he happy with what the style of play that St. Louis has, or is he going to want to, change it up? Looking at some of the other questions. I think Byron Tim has a good note. With a new coach and a massive roster turnover, early 2026 season expectations will need to be realistic. Need to be realistic in a lot of different ways, because I talked about this timeline being condensed on just the sporting director and the coaching search. If Diego's comments are to be believed and really trusted on that, not trusted, but be believed and taken as gospel, then we're talking about 5 months until training camp opens, and you're going to have a sporting director in place. You're going to have a sporting director in place in time to weigh in on the coaching search and the coaching hire. It could just be as little as signing off on the coach, but it also could be helping with the search. And then you're talking about making roster decisions at the end of the season. Those decisions are made in November and December. So that's even more condensed. That's the part of this whole thing that gives me the most concern. The biggest heart palpitations about this whole thing is the timeline we're operating under. There's no perfect timeline. I'll say that. There's not a perfect blueprint that says if you're given 3 months, you should be able to hire a sporting director. If you're given a month after that, you should be able to hire a coach. That's not how any of this works. But I'm just looking at the track record that St. Louis has of 5 months of looking last year for Lutz Pfannenstiel and Diego Gigliani to hire a head coach, and they failed. And if a lot of that, as Manuel Veth alludes to on Blue Sky, was a Lutz call, if Lutz was the reason that we hired Olaf Melberg, then we take a little bit of the onus off of Diego, and we understand a little bit more about why this move was made now. That's a key thing into this. Is let's not take preconceived notions as gospel here of saying, well, it was Lutz and Diego 50-50 split of choosing to hire Olaf. We don't know that to be the case. And I think that part of it is a little dangerous, and it's worrisome. You don't need to really be thinking about it that way. That does us no good, really. To think that Diego's responsible for Olaf and only Lutz was fired here, and Diego was responsible for the fire of Bradley Carnell and only Lutz lost his job here. But we do, as a fan base and as St. Louisans, I think you can make the argument that Diego is responsible for a lot of things, but this is the first moment where that is 100% absolutely true and demonstrable. Diego comes in, but it's still Lutz's team on the sporting side. This move right here puts that onto Diego for choosing the sporting director, who can help them choose the coach. And at this point in time, it's very easy to see that these player negotiations, the contracts at the end of the season, that's going to fall under the purview of Diego and Hack. That Hackworth might take the lead on that. I don't know. But at the same time, those two, unless they get somebody in very, very quickly, which would surprise me, those two are going to be making the decisions. Question in the chat, Matt, what percentage of the team for next year is currently on the roster? 50% was the question thrown out. Well, with about, I think, 14 contracts that are going to be up with options, plus, Berkey, and I think with Berkey not having an option on that, I see just over 50% returning. I see a complete turnover in the supplemental roster. I think this is the moment where I was talking to Stu Holker the other day, and I was trying to make the argument that it worries me that you have so many roster spots to fill at the end of the season. And this is almost aside from Lutz, but you have so many roster slots to fill at the end of the season that Lutz's record is very minimalistic. He put the roster together, but we're talking like 4 players maybe per window that turned over. And that's a pretty low number. I think Johnny Klein might have been the only player whose option we declined last season. Very few players that were actually declined last season. And so that consistency in low quality, admittedly, was probably a factor in this downfall. And that leads me to think okay, you brought all these players back, but now you're asking Diego and Hackworth probably, or a brand new sporting director who's brand new to the organization, to be making all of these decisions on 14 players. It's not just, all right, these players have been underperforming, we should get rid of them. You have to replace those players, and you have to replace those players meaningfully. You can't just say, all right, Tristan Blackman's going to be available from Vancouver, let's go scoop him up. No, you have to be a lot more intentional in building this. And that's the worry to me, is we've never seen that size of a turnover from year to year from St. Louis outside of the initial roster build. And I know it's only 3 years, but that seems like a lot. And it has not been proven that it can be done. More or less, it wants to be done. But then again, I think you have this inflection point again that we're talking about, where you purposefully built some of these contracts throughout up and down the roster to expire in 2025 to give you this opportunity. It's just a dangerous moment to me for this opportunity to fall while you just fired your sporting director. The identity of the team is completely in flux at this point, and I think you need stability as much as possible. So that's why I do like this question, or this comment by Phil Barbier in here saying, I think Lutz being fired makes it even more imperative that the new sporting director keeps Berkey. Consistency right now doesn't exist with St. Louis. We haven't had a consistent head coach. We now don't have a consistent sporting director. It's Roman Berkey and Lutz. I'm sorry, it's Roman Berkey and Leuven and Klaus and maybe a couple other players that are consistent. And that's your consistency. I think this comment by Bucket Hat is a pretty good one when it comes to how we're going to fill this spot. I think we need a guy like Hack at sporting director with ties and knowledge of the U.S. It's not just the U.S. too. Hackworth has plenty of knowledge abroad, and we have scouts. We have people looking at players. It's not just Lutz's connections, though. That will be a very interesting wrinkle to follow in all this. Is the jokes are already making their way around social media about will we go from being a German Central European type club now to, will that be part of the switch in model when we bring in a new sporting director? What does Diego really think about that? And so that's going to be something very much to follow as well. The scouting network the city has, how will that transform? Where will we start to hear rumblings in the future of some of these hirings? What Hackworth will absolutely bring is a more American flair to this, no doubt. His contacts in the U.S. soccer ecosystem are borderline unrivaled. And so Hackworth does bring a whole lot to that front. If that's how you want to, I think maybe the best word is like focus your sporting director's responsibility. Like I'm thinking in FIFA, for instance, when you have like that home base, the club to build off of, and then you can send scouts into other parts of the world. That kind of a mindset where you have Hackworth with this American focus, and that's how you might build your roster. But you have scouts that are in South America, still in Europe, Scandinavia, Africa, Asia, all these different places. So the other thing I'll say is be wary of just putting all of your eggs and all of your desires into a known quantity. I alluded to this earlier, but we know Hack, right? And I'm not saying this about Hack. I'm saying this about guys like Peter Vermees and Jim Curtin, the two other names. Jim Curtin, just because he had success in Philadelphia, success from one club doesn't necessarily translate to another. I'm not saying it won't. I'm not saying it can't. I'm just saying you don't necessarily want to toss all of your hopes onto one known person because you've seen them have success in Major League Soccer for a different club with a different circumstances. Just because that's happened doesn't mean they're going to be able to replicate it here. Especially somebody who is so ingrained in an organization like Curtin with Philadelphia, like Peter Vermees with Kansas City. It's just it's a slightly dangerous take to have. But it's not to say they shouldn't be interviewed if they want the job or if we can land it. Because you go back to Bradley Carnell, who has had success in Philadelphia, and that I think goes to the inconsistency with the organization that Diego referenced with Lutz. Thinking back to the Carnell firing and now this, is the timing odd? Like neither got a chance to ride out the transfer window moves. Justin Phelps. No, actually, I think this one, because of the sporting director perspective, this one's a different beast altogether. With the head coach, I'm totally behind you. It was a very odd timing to fire Bradley Carnell at that time because he, as head coach, it's not his responsibility to bring in the players. It's not his responsibility to look good on paper. That's a big thing. It's Bradley Carnell's and the head coach's responsibility to produce results on the field with the good on paper team that the sporting director has put together for you. What this tells me is what I said earlier, that the paper version of this team on paper, this is not what Diego and Carolyn wanted this club to be. That's the biggest thing that I can point to and why the timing makes sense after this transfer window. They were not happy with the last transfer window. They're not happy with this transfer window. And they're at least starting the process early enough to where the concerns that I have about this offseason and the timing, at least they're starting the process now, right after the transfer window. If we would have gotten, imagine this, just close your eyes and imagine this. If we had waited until the end of this season, so season's over, we missed the playoffs, we have 14 contracts coming up, we are about to remake this roster. The offseason windows have not yet gotten here. They're just a few weeks away. If we get to that point and then they fire Lutz, how much more of an uproar would we all be in because of that timing versus this? To me, the sporting director's window is the body of work. You don't need to see them have success to necessarily judge the sporting director. You can do that at least a little bit on paper, on what you see, on what you expect to have been brought into the club. If the move's going to happen this year, I'm glad it happened now, as opposed to the end of the season. I will say that. So I've had my skepticism hat on this entire show, and I can't help but be skeptical in the direction in a lot of ways because we're seeing such a downward trajectory in the club that we love. We need a righting of this ship desperately, and we're not seeing it so far. So that has led to a lot of the skepticism I'm talking about. But to their credit, this has to go said. If you were planning on making the move, now is a much better time to do it than the end of the season. That would have sent shockwaves through your 2026 season in a negative way, put you way behind the 8 ball, and been derided by fans so significantly. But now there's a knee-jerk reaction to why now after the transfer window. Hopefully my explanation may help. I don't know if it's the exact right one, but it makes sense to me. So hopefully that helps with a little bit of an understanding. And as the dust settles in all of this, I think there is that window that exists now. So while this is the team, right? You don't have work going into the 2025 team. Not saying their eyes are off of it, but I'm saying that think about it as you're turning the keys over to David Critchley. David Critchley, who if we keep consistent with what Lutz said, Critchley has the job to the end of the season. And I don't see any reason why that changes, especially with all the other turmoil and turbulence going on. But I think the idea is you have given the keys to Critchley now, and you can focus on what's to come in the offseason. And you now have months and months that Diego and Hackworth can do that. So I think that's where we'll call it here on this episode of Flyover Footy. Thank you so much for joining me. I will be back maybe Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, but definitely Thursday for preview to the Houston Dynamo home game. This, I think, has an opportunity to be a new start for St. Louis City under Diego and Hackworth, at least right now. If you have any other questions, drop them to me at Matt Baker STL on the socials.